I did a trilogy on the American Empire. The first was called The Twilight of American Culture. The second one was called Dark Ages America. And then the one I just published, oil, we need oil. The third one that I just published is called Why America Failed. In between number 2 and number 3, I did a collection of essays called A Question of Values, which you can buy off of Amazon. I would really recommend you take a look at that because there's material in that collection of essays you will not find anywhere else and which is kind of essential to the whole argument. This particular talk is located between that collection of essays and Why America Failed. So it sort of brings you up to date with regard to the last book, but it doesn't get into Why America Failed itself, so you're out of luck. You'll have to read the book. So let me just get into it, and then we can have some discussion about the whole topic. Despite the great pressure to conform in the United States, to celebrate the U.S. as the best system in the world, the nation does not lack for critics. The last 2 decades have seen numerous works criticizing U.S. foreign policy, U.S. domestic policy, especially economic policy, the American educational system, court system, military, media, corporate control of everything, and so on and so forth. Most of this is very astute. I've learned a lot from reading these studies. But 2 things, in my opinion, are lacking in them and have a very hard time making it into the public eye, partly because Americans are not trained to think in a holistic or synthetic manner, and partly because the sort of analysis I have in mind is too close to the bone. It's nerve-wracking for most Americans to hear. First thing that these works lack is an integration of the various factors that are tearing the country apart. In other words, these studies tend to be institution-specific, as though the institution under examination existed in a kind of vacuum and could really be understood apart from the other institutions. The second thing that I find lacking in these studies is a relationship to the culture at large, to the values and behaviors that Americans manifest on a daily basis. As a result, these critiques are finally superficial. They don't really go to the root of the problem, and this avoidance enables them to be optimistic, which in fact places them in the American mainstream. We're always smiling. Oh, I erased the smiley face. I had a smiley face. The authors conclude their studies with practical recommendations as to how the institutional dysfunctions that they've identified can be rectified. And they are, as a result, not much of a threat. It's usually a mechanical analysis with a mechanical solution. If the authors were to realize that these problems do not exist in a vacuum, but are related to all the other problems and are finally rooted in the American culture itself, in its DNA, as it were, the prognosis would not be so rosy, because it would become clear that there was simply no way out. There really is no way to turn things around at this point, as far as I can see. Let me give you 2 examples. You all know these. Michael Moore, Noam Chomsky. I respect them enormously. I've learned a lot from them. I think they've done a lot to raise awareness of the United States, of the dead ends of American foreign and domestic policy. But both of these writers assume that the problem is coming from the top, that is, from corporations and the Pentagon. And to some extent, it's true, of course. But the problem is that this analysis rests on a theory of false consciousness. That is to say, the belief that these institutions have pulled the eyes over the wool of the average American. And so that, and assumes that the average American is rational and well-intentioned and so on, so that the solution is one of education. You want to pull the wool away from the eyes, and then somehow, spontaneously, the citizenry is going to awaken and commit itself to populism or democratic socialism or something like this. What if it turns out that the wool is the eyes? That's what I suspect. The so-called average American citizen really does want, as Janis Joplin famously put it, a Mercedes-Benz. I mean, that's what life is about in the United States. And he or she is usually grateful to corporations and, for supplying us with oceans of consumer goods, and to the Pentagon for protecting us from those awful Arabs lurking in the Middle East, Well then, if that's true, the possibilities for fundamental change are quite small, because what would be called for is a set of very different institutions and a very different type of culture. And I can't see that there's much chance of that. America is what it is, after all. So when I survey the critical scene, I find very few writers who see things synthetically, that is, as an integrated whole, and who relate this to the nature of American culture itself. But there are a few. And the titles of their books give them away. For example, The Puritan Origins of the American Self by Sack Van Berkovich. War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning by Chris Hedges. The Myth of American Diplomacy by Walter Hickson. There are a number of these. And also a number of eminent American historians. Van Woodward, William Appleman Williams, David Potter, or Jackson Lears fall into that category. All these thinkers are radical in the sense of going down to the root of things, and it makes them kind of unusual. Berkovich is a Canadian, born in Montreal, and he taught American studies at Harvard for several decades. And he argues that from as early as 1630, the colonists were imbued with the idea that they were establishing a new nation under the specific direction of Providence, and reenacting the drama of the Exodus in the Old Testament. So, in crossing the Atlantic, which is equivalent to the River Jordan, they were entering the New World, Canaan, flowing with milk and honey, and rejecting the decadence of England and Europe in general, which is equivalent to ancient Egypt, and establishing a new order, the New Jerusalem, and that all of this is in accordance with God's will. The historian Walter Hickson claims that American identity originally coalesced around the idea of the other, whoever it was, as being savage, and therefore that American identity has always been based on war. We never really negotiated anything with anyone, as other nations found out, usually too late. Chris Hedges amplifies this notion by arguing that war gives Americans a reason for being, a meaning to their lives. All this to me is much more sophisticated than some purported theory of false consciousness or the belief that Americans are fundamentally well-intentioned and rational. Instead, it argues that Americans are, and have been since our earliest days, hopelessly neurotic, or even worse, perhaps, and that the belief that we can pursue a different path at this stage is quite diluted, requiring, as it would, the yanking out of the American psyche by its very roots. I like to think that I fall into this latter category of historian only because I think that this version of American history is the one that's really faithful to reality. There are a number of themes that we could discuss at this point around that. I've examined a number of them in my trilogy on the American Empire. But since you don't want me to be speaking for 12 or 14 hours, I'm guessing, let me just take one. This is one that I introduced in the collection of essays I mentioned, The Question of Values, specifically in the essay called Locating the Enemy. And in that essay, I borrowed a concept from Hegel, Hegel's concept of negative identity. By negative, Hegel didn't mean bad. He meant reactive. In other words, a negative identity is one that's formed in opposition to someone or something else. That's the concept of negative identity. It enables you to develop very strong ego boundaries, always pushing against your enemy, but since it's formed in opposition to something, it itself has no real content. As a result, it looks strong, but it's actually weak because its self-definition is simply relational. What would a master be? In a very famous passage, Hegel writes, what would a master be without a slave? Take away the slave, and the master would have nothing to define himself by. Well, what I argue is that the concept of negative identity applies particularly well to the United States and the history of the American continent. Opposition in whatever form provided the colonists with a guiding narrative that enabled them to make sense of their lives. And since, as Berkovich easily demonstrates, this was a religious narrative, as I already mentioned, it didn't take much to turn it into a Manichaean one, in which the enemy, whoever it was the darkest of the dark. The target of this self-righteous hatred has metamorphosed over time, but the form, that of Manichaean opposition, has always remained the same. So Native Americans were quickly seen as little more than savages, an obstacle to, quote, civilization, and treated accordingly. And every Thanksgiving, Americans sit down, carve up a turkey, and celebrate the genocide and near extinction of an entire indigenous people. That is the fact. The next target was the British, which surfaced in the American Revolution, although this really goes back to the early 17th century when the Pilgrims left for America, deciding that Britain was decadent and corrupt, as hierarchical and organic and so on, as opposed to the citizens of the future United States who were non-British, anti-monarchical, republican, and so on. The terror and brutality that was visited upon the Loyalists, which was nearly 500,000 people, 30% of the American population at that time, never somehow gets discussed in American history books. You don't learn about it in American high school. But it's been recorded nonetheless. Intimidation, tarring and feathering, confiscation and burning of property, being driven from their homes, frequently murdered as traitors. If you want to read the full story, I suggest a book by Maya Jasanoff called Liberty's Exiles, which is a really comprehensive study of this. There are very few American books in this genre. I'm guessing that Canadian and British high school and college textbooks are somewhat different on this score than the American ones, but maybe not. Moving right along, we come to opposition to Mexico, which involved provoking a phony war and then stealing more than half of that country. As in the case of the American Indians, it was convenient to cast the Mexican people as ignorant and undeveloped, as savages of some sort, lacking the go-go energy of U.S. capitalism, which is an unfortunate stereotype that persists to some extent down to the present day. As I said, I know this firsthand. I live in Mexico. Like the Native Americans, the Mexican were seen as being in the way of progress, of American manifest destiny, again ordained by God. In fact, the Mexican government was quite aware of whom it was dealing with. In the late 1820s, a Mexican commission wrote that the Americans were, quote, an ambitious people, always ready to encroach upon their neighbors without a spark of good faith. Robert Kagan writes in his book Dangerous Nation, great title, virtually everybody viewed the United States in this way. Spanish, French, Russians, British, and the French diplomats called the American populace warlike and restless. Shortly after that, the same framework that had been used to characterize Native Americans and Mexicans was applied by the North to the American South. A lazy, do-nothing society sitting in the way of progress. As I discuss in the book Why America Failed, it was not Northern opposition to slavery that triggered the Civil War. That's a myth that Americans like to believe, but it's simply not so. I'm not excusing slavery. It may well be argued that without the war, slavery would have continued for several decades more and therefore was justified. But the more fundamental conflict, which I argue in the book, is that it was a clash of cultures. The slow, easy way of the South, as opposed to the restless economic expansion of the North. Both sides regarded each other as the devil incarnate by 1861, and the result was the loss of 625,000 lives and a massive destruction of the South, epitomized by Sherman's March to the Sea. These scars still exist. To the South, the war is not really over, and the resentment runs very deep to this day. The Germans were next. That's an opposition that seems thoroughly justified, in fact. And then came the, quote, godless communists. The conversion of the Russians from ally to enemy occurred almost overnight. It isn't difficult to see why. With the Axis powers out of the picture, there had to be an enemy in place to fill the resulting vacuum. And although the USSR was repressive in the extreme, it did not, as the American diplomat George Kennan was later to argue, have to be cast as the ultimate enemy because its real goal lay in securing its own borders. In fact, KGB files that came open after the fall of the Soviet Union, open for just a few years, revealed that Russia's real fear during that time was not the United States, but a rearmed Germany. There was no attempt, however, to negotiate anything with Russia at that time. As Stalin pointed out as early as 1946, for the Americans, negotiation actually meant capitulation. In any case, the Cold War kept the U.S. busy for decades, and the so-called perimeter defense, which held that any disturbance in the world was cause for U.S. military action, led to the disasters of Iran, Guatemala, Vietnam, Chile, and on and on and on. If you'd like to read about that long list, I suggest the works of Stephen Kinzer, William Blum, Walter Lefebvre, and others that document all of this. Of course, the psychological structure of negative identity led to a crisis when the Soviet Union finally collapsed. Suddenly, Americans had no one to define themselves against. The Gulf War of '91 helped fill the gap for a time, but the Clinton years were largely meaningless without an enemy. We really had no idea of who we were, so we filled up the empty space with Monica Lewinsky and O.J. Simpson, nonsense like this. But finally, the Islamic world did us the greatest favor possible. It attacked us. And so, overnight, terrorism replaced communism as the crucial buzzword, and Bush Jr., like Reagan in characterizing the Soviet Union, did not hesitate to frame the contest as a cosmic war between good and evil, a crusade. Well, that's going to fill the gap, won't it? There was no possible discussion of American foreign policy in the Middle East as having played a role in these events, even though historians have, lots and lots of books on the subject of our role in the Middle East. Such a notion was tantamount to treason. Susan Sontag lost her job at the New Yorker for writing a short blurb saying, before we decide these people are insane, maybe you ought to look at the history of U.S. foreign policy. You can't talk like that, and you can't even talk like that today. No, our enemies were evil or insane, preferably both, end of story. To this day, under the Obama administration, American tax dollars pay for workshops that teach the police and the military that Islam is an evil religion out to destroy America and which therefore must be destroyed first. This is official government policy to spread this kind of hatred, and American tax dollars pay for it. If you'd like to run down the names of the people involved, the amounts of money, the programs, and so on, check out Chris Hedges' article on truthdig.com, May 9th, 2011. George Kennan tried to warn the American government that making a monolith out of communism was a gross misunderstanding, that there were huge differences and conflicts between, for example, Russia and China. But since Manichaeanism requires cardboard figures, American presidents from Truman on paid no attention to his advice. A similar thing now exists with respect to Islam. It turns out that only about 10% of American Muslims are actually religious. For most of them, Islam is more of a social kind of thing than anything else. In the sense, they're a lot like the Jews, Even then, very few religious Muslims are jihadists. But when your identity is a negative one in the Hegelian sense, this type of nuance has to be kept out of public consciousness. So, for example, Americans tend to regard Pakistan as an awful, dark place, the country that hid Osama bin Laden from American troops, or that harbors al-Qaeda operatives, or that's in league with the Taliban. What would Americans say if they read in the newspapers, as I did last June when I was in London, in The Guardian, that a very popular TV show in Pakistan is that of a Jon Stewart-type comedian who pokes fun at the government and hosts songs like Burqa Woman, which ridicules Muslim fundamentalism. The song is actually based on that. It's the same music as the old song by Roy Orbison, Pretty Woman, but the words are changed. So it's Burqa Woman walking down the street, Burqa Woman with your sexy feet. See, because that's all you can see.
Oh my God.
Yeah, Of course, none of this got picked up by the American press. There would never be such an article like that in the American press. You think the Cleveland Plain Dealer is going to write this? You know, this would weaken our ability to paint the enemy as totally dark. And this could potentially lead to a softening of ego boundaries, a questioning of who we are beyond the nation in opposition to something. And frankly, this scares the hell out of Americans because then the game would be up. Marshall McLuhan, another favorite Canadian of mine, once stated, all forms of violence are quests for identity. Let me repeat that. All forms of violence are quests for identity. More recently, David Shulman, who's professor of humanities at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, wrote, "There is nothing more precious than an enemy, especially one whom you have largely created by your own acts and who plays some necessary role in the inner drama of your soul." Well, that's right on, isn't it? What is the American soul? Does the U.S. even have one? What beyond opposition defines the United States? When you say "we the people," the first line of the Constitution, what are you talking about? We the people what? This emptiness at the center makes the American quest for identity especially acute, and thus our politics especially violent. The policy is always one of scorched earth. It's always one of shock and awe. In the fullness of time, in fact, it's we who prove to be the savages. And all of this without much awareness or conscious reflection. Criticism is not possible in a Manichaean world. The U.S. is very good at marginalizing writers who attempt to critique the country in a fundamental way. Americans aren't interested in such things anyway, which is why overt censorship is really unnecessary in the U.S. I talk a lot in Latin America, and I get the typical question is, how come you're not censored? You know, and I say, the United States doesn't even want to bother. I mean, why would they have to? The information glut of garbage coming across screens in the United States is so enormous that any single writer is just drowned out by it. Why would they even, they would be worse. They would draw attention to me. You know, I mean, they're not going to do that. So the result is that, as in the famous painting by Goya, Saturn devouring his son, the U.S. is now imploding. It's eating itself alive. I argued this in 2006 in Dark Ages America, and the data substantiating this in the 6 years since that book was published that have accumulated are absolutely enormous. There is not a single American institution that is not seriously corrupt. And I could stand here for several hours documenting that. Instead, let me just give you a few examples so you get some idea of this. Number one, Ronald Dworkin, one of America's leading intellectuals, did an essay about 2 years ago in the New York Review of Books showing that the Supreme Court has become a court of men and not of law. In the case of 5 out of the 9 justices, he shows, decisions are made in advance in a right-wing political direction, and then the justification of the decision is trotted out after the fact, even though it often violates the Constitution. Number 2, in their book Academically Adrift, the sociologists Richard Aram and Josipa Roxa report that after 2 years of college, 45% of American students haven't learned anything. Especially, they haven't learned critical analysis, critical reasoning, critical thinking, and analysis of situations. They can't do it. They don't know the difference between an argument and an opinion. No idea what evidence is. And also that after 4 years, 36% haven't learned anything. Most students that they interviewed defined college as a social, not an academic experience. Half the students in their study said that they hadn't taken a single course in the previous semester that required more than 20 pages of writing, and a third said they hadn't taken a course requiring more than 40 pages of reading. A Marist poll of last July showed that 42% of American adults are unaware that the U.S. declared its independence in 1776. And that figure increases to 69% for the under 30 age group. 25% of Americans don't know from which country the United States seceded. Ghana? Bulgaria? What was it? A recent Newsweek poll revealed that 73% of Americans can't give the official version of why we fought the Cold War, and 44% are unable to say what the Bill of Rights is. A poll taken in the Oklahoma public school system last year turned up the fact that 77% of the student body was unable to identify who George Washington was. It's pretty impressive, 77%. In a number of cities, libraries have closed for lack of funding and probably lack of interest as well. People aren't reading anymore, as you have observed. You know, you walk into cafes, everybody's glued to a screen. They're not reading books. In January of 2011, a serious presidential candidate praised the Founding Fathers for, quote, working tirelessly to abolish slavery. In fact, these Founding Fathers agreed that a black person legally constituted 60% of a human being and enshrined slavery in the Constitution. She also claimed that the U.S. government was colluding with the Chinese to abolish the dollar. On August 18th, after her straw poll victory in Iowa, she asserted that the American people are concerned about the rise of the Soviet Union, which is a threat. Is, present tense. I don't understand why she omitted Hitler. I understand he's poised to invade Poland any moment now. There were other things, you know, in one of the GOP presidential debates, she said, Obama has invaded Libya and now he's moving on to Africa. Where did she think Libya was? Near Finland somewhere? Now, the thing that's interesting, this was Michelle Obama, who since dropped out of the race for just being an embarrassment as a human being. Sorry? Bachmann, sorry, Michelle Bachmann. Essentially, this person was a dimwit. But the important thing is that she had a huge political following. You had millions of people who seriously considered a moron presidential material. Other stuff. The new high school curriculum in American history in Texas now includes a unit on Estee Lauder. But it does not have a unit on George Washington, John Adams, or Thomas Jefferson. When I first read this, I thought I was reading that satirical online publication, The Onion, you know? I mean, how could this be? Estee Lauder? And it turned out that the article was in the Austin Statesman. It was absolutely correct. It was, except that satire is now reality in American politics. You know, these GOP candidates are preposterous. I mean, they're walking jokes. Why not a unit, perhaps next year or the year after, on Kim Kardashian? You know, I mean, we don't need to be studying Franklin Roosevelt, but Kim Kardashian, you know. Maybe, you know, there's one thing on her rear end and another on her psoriasis. You know, you can laugh, but 2 years ago, if I had suggested Estee Lauder, you know. Philip Green, political scientist, in an article he wrote last year, said, what has seized a critical mass of Americans is historical amnesia and intellectual vacuity. The result is a politics of social self-destruction. Now, this is important to me because this is the dimension that's always missing from people like Noam Chomsky or Michael Moore, is that they're assuming that the American population is actually smart. Let me tell you, they're real dumb. And it is politically incorrect to say that. But once you realize that 77% of an entire high school system, public school system, doesn't know who George Washington is, you get some idea of where we're coming from, you know. What can be possibly done to change a country that's that stupid? But you're not allowed to say that in public, except I do. But I get hate mail. That's okay. Number 3, in the aftermath of the crash of 2008, the very people who promulgated the ideology that led to the crash got appointed as the president's economic advisors. Lawrence Summers, Timothy Geithner, Ben Bernanke, among others. Not a single Wall Street financial leader has faced jail. Indeed, major corporate figures who brought the economy down were awarded huge bonuses, and some secured prestigious appointments at Johns Hopkins University and the Brookings Institution. Meanwhile, the very practices that led to the crash, CDOs, credit default swaps, derivatives, and the whole 9 yards, are now being pursued with even more vigor than they were prior to the crash. So what do you think is going to happen in the future? Nobel economist Paul Krugman asks, somewhat rhetorically, how is it that in the wake of the obvious failure of casino capitalism and neoliberalism, blame for the crash is not put on the banks, which ultimately received bailouts of upwards of $19 trillion, and the corporations, but it's put on the public sector? Number 4, between 1987 and 2007, the number of Americans so disabled by mental disorders that they qualified for supplemental security income or Social Security disability insurance increased 2.5 times, so that now 1 out of 76 Americans falls into this category. For children, during that same time period, the increase was 35 times. And mental illness is now the leading cause of disability among the child population in the United States. A survey of American adults conducted by the National Institute of Mental Health, 2001 to 2003, found that 46% of them met the criteria of the American Psychiatric Association for being mentally ill at some point in their lives. I found that 46% figure very low. I thought it should be like 86%. 10% of Americans over the age of 6, actually it's now back down to age 4, take antidepressants. So we have toddlers on Prozac now, lots of them. And I read elsewhere that in terms of the global market, that is dollar sales, American consumption of antidepressants amounts to 2/3 of the entire world's consumption of antidepressants. So you have a country with less than 5% of the world population consuming 2/3 of the antidepressants of the world. This ought to tell you something about this country. Some time ago, I was visiting a friend in London a few months ago, and she had worked as an art consultant in New York for many years. And she had picked up in New York at some place like Woolworth, although they don't exist anymore, a plaque that was a satirical plaque that she had on her wall. And the heading of the plaque was, "Evenings at 7 in the Parish Hall." And there was the list of events. Monday, alcoholics. Tuesday, abused spouses. Wednesday, eating disorders. Thursday, drug addiction. Friday, teen suicide. Saturday, soup kitchen. And finally, the Sunday sermon at 9 a.m., America's Joyous Future. Somebody had a sense of humor. Number 5, the infrastructure in the United States is crumbling and there is no money to fix it. There is also, in some cases, ideological opposition to fixing it. The levees of New Orleans are in the same shape now that they were before Katrina. I read an article some time ago about the attempt to address this. I didn't clip the article, however, so I can't remember whether it's at the municipal level of New Orleans or the state level of Louisiana. But the councilman involved stated that they did not want to move on this problem because it would require a cooperative effort, and this, they said, meant socialism. So apparently working together with other people is equivalent to socialism in the United States, and it's better to risk another Katrina than to have that. It doesn't get dumber than this. I mean, this is rock bottom stupidity. 6, the national debt now stands at more than $14 trillion, and the official figure for poverty and hunger is 45 million citizens. However, this is based on very old criteria for what constitutes a livable budget, going back to the 60s. The actual figure is about 100 million, or a third of the country. And nearly, despite what you read about official figures of unemployment, the real statistics of unemployment, that is that nearly 20% of American adults are out of work. 1 out of 5 people, with, economists tell us, little prospect of finding a job for the next 10 years. Number 7, the president now has the right, although it violates the Geneva Accords, to designate any American citizen, or frankly anyone on the planet, an enemy and have him or her assassinated. Indeed, it actually happened last September when Mr. Obama had 2 American citizens, Anwar al-Awlaki and Samir Khan, murdered. Now, you know, I mean, maybe they were involved in al-Qaeda activity and maybe not. Nothing was firmly established. But the U.S. Constitution does say that regardless of the crime, and no matter how heinous it is, you get your day in court. You have the right to defend yourself. You don't have that anymore. If the president wants to rub you out, he just does. In an essay entitled America's Disappeared from last July, Chris Hedges writes, torture, prolonged detention without trial, sexual humiliation, rape, disappearance, extortion, looting, random murder, and abuse have become, as in Argentina during the Dirty War, part of our own subterranean world of detention sites and torture centers. We know of at least 100 detainees who died during interrogations at our black sites. There are probably many, many more whose fate has never been made public. Tens of thousands of Muslim men and women have passed through our clandestine detention centers without due process. Now he's quoting here General Barry McCaffrey, who's safely retired. We tortured people unmercifully. We probably murdered dozens of them, both the armed forces and the CIA. Tens of thousands of Americans are being held in super maximum security prisons where they're deprived of contact and psychologically destroyed. Undocumented workers are rounded up and vanish from their families for weeks or months. Militarized police units break down the doors of some 40,000 Americans every year and haul them away in the dead of night as if they were enemy combatants. Habeas corpus no longer exists. Once again, Philip Green's comment on this. A people that accepts as a normal course of events the bombing of civilians, torture, kidnapping, indefinite detention, assassination, secret governments at home, and covert wars abroad has lost touch with the moral basis of civil society. I want to add that on December 31st of last year, Mr. Obama signed into law something called the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act. And the NDAA gives the president the right to scoop up anybody that he suspects of terrorism. They don't have to be guilty of it. They can just be suspected of it, and put away without notice for as long as the president wants. In other words, to disappear someone into Guantanamo or our black sites in Uzbekistan or whatever, that is now legal. It violates Geneva Accords, of course, but it's now legal in the United States for the president to do it. Who then qualifies as a terrorist? If you can, this can happen to you just because you're suspected of it. Who qualifies? According to the Department of Justice, you can be suspected of terrorism if you have a loaded weapon in your house. That's 50% of the American population. You can be suspected of terrorism if you have more than 7 days' supply of food in your house. I do, don't you? You can be suspected of terrorism if you have fingers missing from a hand. Okay, let's say you had an industrial accident, something like that. So basically, everybody in the United States is a potential terrorist, and anybody can be scooped up and dropped off in Guantanamo for 10 years without anybody knowing what happened to you. How long before critics and dissenters are labeled intellectual terrorists? There is also, I learned, a facility in Marion, Illinois. It's called CMU, or Communication Management Unit. This came out in an interview that Amy Goodman did last June. It was a documentary called If a Tree Falls. And it turns out that the description of the CMUs, it's a secretive prison unit in Marion, Illinois, and she interviewed one of the people who had been incarcerated there. He was a animal rights activist. And it turns out that that facility in Marion, Illinois is being used not only for al-Qaeda suspects, but any activist whatsoever in any field. If they don't like you, they can put you there. I wrote Chris Hedges about it. I was so disturbed when I ran across this that I wrote Chris Hedges about this. Do you know anything about this? He said, oh yes, the mechanism, the legal and physical mechanisms are completely in place for this, and they are putting any activist that they don't like into these detention centers. So how long before that will be extended to anybody they don't like? People who say things about the United States that are uncomplimentary. How long? 5 years? 10 years? In general, there are more than 6 million people under correctional supervision in the United States. More people are now in jail in the US than were in the Gulag under Stalin. Let's be clear as to what all this means. This is really the end of the Bill of Rights, the one document that made American democracy distinctive since the first 10 amendments to the Constitution were passed in 1791. There is no way to refute the argument I know of that the United States is now officially a police state. Doesn't make me happy to say that. Number 8, the U.S. military, which soaks up 50% of the discretionary budget, is apparently unable to win 2 wars in 2 small countries. In fact, it has not had a serious victory since World War II, after which it decided to play it safe and stick to tin pot dictators and minor nations. Number 9, a U.S. intelligence report released in 2008 entitled Global Trends 2025 predicts a steady decline in American dominance over the coming decades, with U.S. leadership, quote, eroding at an accelerating pace in political, economic, and arguably cultural areas. To my knowledge, the President has never mentioned this report, nor has anyone in public office. But in fact, it was reported on in the Washington Post. You can download it now. Number 10, on July 10th of 2010, the Washington Post reported that 854,000 people work for the NSA, the National Security Agency, in 33 building complexes amounting to 17 million square feet of space in the DC metro area. Every day, collection systems at the NSA intercept and store 1.7 billion emails and phone calls of American citizens in what amounts to a vast domestic spy system. Writing in the New Yorker on May 23rd of last year, Jane Meyer reported that the NSA has 3 times the budget of the CIA and has the capacity to download every 6 hours electronic communications equivalent to the entire contents of the Library of Congress. They also developed a program called Thin Thread that enables computers to scan the material for keywords, and they collect the billing records and the dialed phone numbers of every single person in the country. In violation of communications laws, AT&T, Verizon, and Bell South have opened their electronic records to the government. At the height of its insanity, the Stasi in East Germany was spying on 1 out of every 7 citizens. The United States is now spying on 7 out of every 7 citizens. 11, you can now go to jail in the United States simply for speaking. In July of 2011, environmental activist Tim DeChristopher was sentenced to 2 years in prison for his repeated declaration that environmental protection required civil, that is to say, nonviolent, disobedience. One wonders if the same judge, D. Benson, would have also put Rosa Parks and Mahatma Gandhi in jail had he been around during their lifetimes. Number 12, this is my favorite. It also occurred last July. Somehow it's symbolic to me of what's been going on in the U.S. the last 60 years. Police in Georgia shut down a lemonade stand being run by 3 girls ages 10 to 14. They were trying to save up money for a trip to a local water park. The police said that they didn't know what was in the lemonade, that is, the police didn't know. In addition, that the girls needed a business license, a peddler's permit, and a food permit in order to run the stand, which it turns out costs $50 a day. Well, that's a dozen examples. Let me stop there. As I say, we could go on for several hours. Although he doesn't get into the issue of negative identity per se, the French writer Denis Duclos, who is a director of the CNRS, the prestigious research institute in Paris, pegged the problem of the obsession with having an enemy and the violence that results from that in a book he wrote in 1994, Le Complexe de Loup-garou, The Werewolf Complex. In his epilogue to the edition of 2005, Duclos writes that America has always depended on a werewolf figure, a dark, savage beast that is supposedly out to destroy it. The beast, he says, changes in content, but the form is always the same. At the center of this is a terrible fear that Americans have of emptiness, which is an anxiety of not existing, and which they disguise with a hyperactive optimism. Have a nice day. A curious society, he writes, of people who don't really know who they are. Like the Romans, they already see themselves under siege, which could finally trigger a fascist populism, which we now have in the Tea Party. The American fear of the monster has always marked its history, he writes, whether this exists on the inside or the outside. This leads to isolating the country in a sort of collective psychosis that can only contribute to international instability, which is how most of the world sees us, of course. A few years ago, there was an international poll saying, which country do you think is the greatest threat to world peace? Well, the United States and Israel said Iran, and everybody else said the United States. It was a no-brainer. Writing in Der Spiegel last August, the German journalist Jakob Augstein argues that the United States is basically a failed state, that it's not really part of the West anymore, and that Europe needs to protect itself, to distance itself from what is a very different and apparently insane, that's his word, apparently insane political culture. His evidence for this assertion and for the social disintegration of the United States is depressingly familiar, much of the data I've cited. There is, he concludes, no deliverance in sight. Some time ago, I got an email from a fan who wrote, I just read The Twilight of American Culture and Dark Ages America. I want to thank you for your brilliant and pointless books.
What?
I found that comment quite hilarious because, of course, the guy was right. The books are pointless in that they have no ability to change anything whatsoever. I mean, I'm not deluded on that score, What does mental health mean in an individual case? It means at least this, that the person knows his or her own personal narrative and is able to see it from the outside, and as a result of that transparency, undertakes to do something different. Well, maybe the same thing is true of a nation or a civilization. But I do know that there is very little understanding in the United States as to what the underlying narrative is. I mean, America's not sitting around reading Sackville and Berkovich. You can be sure of it. Americans are not even aware that there is an underlying narrative. They just take things at face value. It's all real. You see it on TV, it's real. That's it. There's also very little interest in thinking about the national identity or lack of national identity in anything more than a superficial way, which is provided, for example, in the pages of the New York Times. In such a situation, change is simply not possible. The odds that we shall continue on this unconscious path are overwhelming. In that sense, my work is pointless. As a writer and social critic, I can't stop the plane from crashing. No one can. I'm rather like the engineer who surveys the wreckage, locates the black box, takes it apart, and writes up the report, the postmortem. And that, I believe, does have some small value, because I think we finally do need to know why America failed. Thank you.
Thank you.
So on that cheery note, I'm wondering if anybody has any questions. Yes, sir.
Number 4, number 5, I think you were saying that the American people are dumb.
Yep.
Could you not use the word ignorant?
I've thought a lot about that because they are two different things. Yeah. I've thought a lot about that. A couple of things, though. One is that finally, if you want to say, if your question is something like, is this genetic? That would be a curious way to put it. And yet, after 400 plus years of the same behavior over and over again, What's the difference whether it's genetic or environmental? You can predict that Americans are going to behave in a certain way.
Well, it's a certain amount of social engineering, too, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree.
You know,
But
where ignorance plays a great part in that, because ignorance is lack of information. So if we feed people information that we want them to know, and only want them to know, such as, you know, or don't give them the information we prefer they didn't know. So we write the history books, leave certain people out, put superficial people in, and make it sound important.
yeah, no, I do agree with you. It's just that, you know, in the late 40s, J.Z. Young in England, a biologist, was the first to argue that the brain is actually quite plastic. And the notion that it stays the same over long periods of time is probably wrong, that you don't need a Darwinian argument to say that the brain can change. Recent studies of screens, the impact of cell phones and laptops and all that on the brain, much of which has been gathered in a book by Nicholas Carr called The Shallows. But if you read the footnotes, the articles by Christine Rosen and Walter Kern and others, there's a lot of evidence that the brain actually changes. Synaptic connections redistribute and change as a result of staring into screens.
Sure.
And they change in a way that is not good. That is to say, the average American, and maybe Canadian now, has the attention span of a gnat.
I'm not disagreeing with your
Yeah.
assumptions, but I totally agree with that. I think it's very difficult to pin people down and get back to what you were talking about in critical thinking.
Yeah.
To actually step outside the box, you have to recognize you're inside it.
Yeah.
Okay, and to get to that point, it does take some reflection.
Right.
And I agree that there's a lot of information and not a lot of knowledge with that information. Okay, don't have a problem with that.
Yeah.
But I guess for me, the problem is the language, is I think you're doing yourself a disservice, and I'm not having a problem with where you're going with this. But ignorance and stupidity are...
No, they're not the same thing, but what I'm saying is the way things practically play out, I wonder, you know, I mean, I recently got, you know, somebody wrote me an angry email on the same subject and said, look, the American brain was the same in 1776 as it is today. And I wrote back and I said, how can you be so sure? Maybe it's not. I mean, if J.Z. Young was correct, there has been a devolution of the American brain. And therefore, it's not merely ignorance, although that's enormous, but there's actually an inability to think, a loss of the, just becoming dumber.
This seems to be a worldwide phenomenon, though, because there's many people here in Canada who would give up on the long census form within our own government. They'd give all this information to Facebook or any benevolent corporation. And so we're back to the same play out.
Yeah.
Where people just are not thinking, right?
Yeah, and certainly as the social media spread around the world and the Maori are carrying cell phones and et cetera, the whole world is going to get dumber. I have no doubt about that. But America is really the cutting edge of all this. I mean, it is the land of the globalization and the exporting of all this stuff, even though a lot of the stuff is manufactured by Nokia in Finland. Nevertheless, you know, America does this, and we've gotten to the point that people literally can't think straight. I mean, there's a failure of that ability. But it's, I mean, you're raising an important point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Anybody? Yes. Yeah.
People aren't reading. It's about credibility, and people aren't reading. They don't have the time because they're too busy surviving. Books cost money. The libraries are shutting down. And what you were saying about college degrees, it's about credibility and who gets to say what. Censorship. Like you said about Susan Sontag. I can't figure out a question here. But I'm just kind of trying to, the culture of dumbing us down is what's happening.
Well, since I raised the discussion in Dark Ages America of how frankly stupid the American people are, there have been a whole series of books on it. There's one called Idiot America, another called Just How Dumb Are We? I mean, there has been a whole series of books. You can just Google America Dumb, and you know, it'll pour out. You know, at least a dozen books in these 6 years on the subject with tons of data on it and so on. How do you recover from that? You don't. You don't. Students typically go to lectures and sit in the back, and instead of listening to the lecture, they're updating their Facebook profile. They're not interested in the lecture or learning anything, you know. And over again, the data on this is enormous, you know. And so every day as this stuff extends its tentacles, people are getting dumber and dumber, and it is becoming a worldwide phenomenon. That's right. In such a situation, a government can literally do anything it wants. Anything. Do you think there was any outcry over the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, when it passed in December 31st? A few days later, I saw a cartoon by Tim Tolles in the Washington Post which showed Obama blowing his nose on the American Constitution. That was the one piece of dissent that I saw. But Americans, not only did they not know what the NDAA is, if you stopped them in the street and asked them about it and explained it, they wouldn't care. It wouldn't make any difference to them at all. I mean, that's how, when you get that stupid, you know, you're just sort of going around drooling and not really concerned too much about things like your freedom. You know? Yeah.
I'm one of the admirers of your Reenchantment of the World.
Oh, thank you.
The book written in the 80s, right?
81, yeah.
But at the same time, the commentary that my colleagues have offered to you resonated with me.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I guess my question is to ask you where you see the book stands now.
The Reenchantment book?
Yes.
Oh.
Obviously, was an invitation to understand what cognitive processes could change people's perception of reality, open up to a more integrative view of the world, overcome reductionism, etc., etc. Some of us read an entire educational and pedagogical program on it. So I'm curious to know how this analysis.
Thank you. This is a good question.
It's more apparent, entirely justified pessimism, I would say. And I'm not an optimist either.
Yeah. Well, you know, I feel that my own pessimism is justified, but it's just my opinion. As far as the Reenchantment book goes, I feel ambivalent about it these days. I have two basic thoughts about it. One is that I now look at myself as a kind of pre-Reformation Loyola. In other words, I was arguing for the overemphasis on intellectual activity as opposed to a different type of sensibility in the context of a nation that was becoming stupider all the time. And now, it seems to me, I would have to argue, before you can get to the holistic argument that's made in Reenchantment, you have to actually know what intellectual analysis and critical thinking is. Some time ago, you know, I mean, I think he's a real creep, Deepak Chopra. He made some statement about we have to get beyond the prison of the intellect. The only problem is that most people have never been in the prison of the intellect. So you can get to Reenchantment after you've been, but for me to be addressing a population that's as stupid as, or ignorant as the American population is, and saying, oh, you know, intellectual activity or critical analysis is overrated, Jesus, I mean, I couldn't do that these days because of that. The part that, so that's the part that I, you know, have feelings about, The part that I still like is the notion of a world that was based on craft and imagination rather than a world that was based on technology and economic expansion. And actually, the next book I'm working on is on the Japanese craft tradition. Kind of difficult because I don't read Japanese. But I'm interested in it because the Japanese had to go through what England, say, did in 200 years. They had to do it in 20, which has left a very neurotic nation in its wake. But there is a layer of the samurai or craft tradition that still exists in Japan, then papered over by Mitsubishi and Sony and so on and so forth, as you see in downtown Tokyo. So the question is, what is the role of Reenchantment in a contemporary technological society? I'm still preoccupied with that question, and I'm glad I raised it in Reenchantment. But the short answer to your question now is that 32 years later, 31 years later, I'm ambivalent. I'm ambivalent about the book. Yeah. Yes, sir.
If I remember correctly, you used to live in Washington, D.C. for a while.
I did.
And now you're in Mexico.
Yep.
So you've outlined all these things about the states. So, you know, there are people from Quakers to the Transition Town movement, all kinds of people attempting to kind of somehow redeem the social fabric. But the portrait you paint, which I don't disagree with, is pretty harsh. So I'm just wondering, what are your practical advice for those people in the room that live in the United States and outside the room about how not to end up in that place in Illinois?
Emigrate. I mean this seriously. When people, especially young people, when they write in, I say, what do you think your old age is going to be in the U.S. when 40 years from now, we're making yet one more war on one fakakta country that's not threatening us at all on the other side of the planet and spending trillions of dollars to do it, when we have no social safety net, Medicare or whatever by that time? What do you think your future is going to look like? If you have any brains now, you'll hit the road and do it soon. And I'm quite serious about that. There's no hyperbole involved. You will have a better life if you go somewhere else. Do the research. Find out, you know, what are your language skills? Can you get into graduate school in France? I mean, whatever it is, go somewhere. You don't want to be an old person in the United States. There's nothing waiting for you. So I'm quite serious about that. For those who write into me and say, I can't leave. I mean, I'm tied into my family, my job, blah, blah, and so on. That's when I refer them to the Twilight book, the first in the series, because I developed the concept there of what I call the new monastic individual, the person who withdraws from the mess of the culture and basically tries to preserve the things that are most valuable about the culture. There is, for example, in Seattle, actually in Bellevue, Washington, a woman named Gloria Di Gaetano who started in the year 2000 a thing called Parent Coaching Institute. They actually had me some months ago come and give a workshop. Excuse me. And basically, she's written a number of books. Marvelous person. Her whole goal is to protect children from the media, to see to it that they don't have cell phones, that they don't have laptops, that they basically are not infected with this poison that sweeps over the mind and destroys it. And she is sort of like, you know, a prophet in the wilderness. Most people aren't going to pay any attention to her any more than they're going to pay any attention to me. But the hope that I had in the Twilight book was that you'd have this tiny fraction that would be saying, what's really important in life? It's that I get yet another smartphone and that I have a big house. That's really important in life? Or is community, craft, friendship, the culture, the nature of the culture in which I'm living in, my sense of value around what I'm doing in this world, maybe that may be just a little more important. Now, I have to tell you that I personally didn't have the strength to resist that pull within Washington, D.C. It was too powerful. I mean, you know, I had some notion that I was going to be a lotus in a cesspool, and after 8 years, I was just a dirty lotus. That's all I had. And so finally, it occurred to me the only way to save myself was to leave. And when I crossed that border, it was like going through a mirror, because all of a sudden, the things I valued most were the highest priority in Mexico, and the things I valued least tended not to be so emphasized, although Mexico is subject to increasing Americanization. That's true. But just a simple example. I crossed the border, needed gas 30 miles in, stopped at a Pemex station that also happened to have a cafeteria. I hadn't had lunch, so I went in. Now, this was being run, the cafeteria was being run by adolescents. I don't know your experience of American adolescents, but they don't have much of a sense of humor. If you try at a checkout counter to start kidding around with them, they get very nervous. You know, you must be out for money or sex or something. You know, it's kind of nervousness. You know, they look at you like scared. I started kidding around with these kids behind the counter, and they were right there. They began to joke with me. And I thought, what planet am I on? If you haven't seen the Tina Fey movie, Mean Girls, she does a parody of this sort of thing that's absolutely accurate, where she walks into a video store and there are teenagers working the counter and she makes a joke and they stare at her as if she crawled out from under a rock. This is the American reaction of young people, to be grim, to live lives that are grim. Man, you know how sick that is? You know how sick that is? And you can tell me all this business about drug trafficking and kidnapping and all that sort of stuff in Mexico. I know what daily life is like there. It's not about worrying about getting kidnapped or being caught, shot by a narco-traficante. I'm not worried about that. What I know is that on a daily basis, the kids do not look at their lives as grim. And to watch kids play soccer using not a ball, because they can't afford it, but bottle caps from a Coca-Cola bottle, and they love it, and you see it, and you say, this is what life is about, not having the latest software application so that you can cut your lawn while you do, whatever it is you're going to do. That's why I specifically titled that book of essays A Question of Values, because it is a question of values. My values were not U.S. values. The problem for me was I was inundated by them, and I felt I was dying. And moving to Mexico gave me new life. Just to give you an idea, within 4 years, I wrote 4 books. One of them being a volume of poetry, and the other a novel. That's what Mexico does. You can't get that in the U.S. You're harried all the time. All the time.
Because of lack of time, money, and energy.
It's also because of a culture that has the wrong values and that's impressing it upon those values on you from TV, your neighbors, and everybody else all the time. And finally, you wind up having nobody to talk to. It wasn't fun for me. And I got plenty of people to talk to now, just in Spanish. Yes, Charlie? Probably not. Probably not. Look, I lived in Canada. This is dated, but I lived in Canada from 80 to 87. And the feeling I had was that it was like the United States, only a bit gentler, a bit blunter, But the thing is that the U.S. propaganda machine for itself is quite powerful. And when I travel, for example, in Chile, the model or Colombia or whatever, the model that they have is the United States. That's what they're looking up to become. And I constantly talk about this in Mexico, and I say, you know what the wrong direction is? What you're doing right now. But I'm an outsider, and why should they pay any attention to me at all? As far as Canada goes, the United States has always been the model. More progress, more economic expansion, and with the current prime minister, you're in real trouble now. So I don't know, there are enclaves, just as there are in the United States, of people trying to hold back that tide. In the United States, for example, in Vermont, there's actually a secessionist movement that wants to, it's called the Second Vermont Republic, that wants to leave, just leave the United States. Of course, if they tried it now, the Marines would be in downtown Burlington within 2 hours, but 40 years from now, maybe it would be possible. So I always say that if you can't get out, then the model is the one I suggested in the Twilight book about you have to form your own enclave to the extent that you can and live a different life. That's the only sane thing to do. I was not able myself to do that in Washington, D.C. I just had to go. Yes?
Speaking of enclaves, do you have anything to say about the survivalist movements in the United States? People going off to Idaho or Montana and just dropping out and hunkering down. It's a very libertarian movement, but it also appeals to certain left-wing anarchist movements as well. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, one thing that indicates is that left and right aren't significant in terms of political categorizations anymore. For example, it was Tea Party spokesmen that have been most vocal against this surveillance that I talked about of Americans through the NSA. It's not been the so-called left in the United States. It's been the extreme right that has objected to it. I'm on their side for that. So the categories are scrambling, and that's that's a solution that some people have undertaken. And to get off the grid, to get free of all this incredibly violent machinery, strikes me as being an important goal. Yeah. Somebody else? Yes, sir.
One of the, well, that whole area of left versus right gets very complicated, but there's, I don't know if you remember Walter Clark from Harper's back in, I think he died in '89 or something.
No.
But he said that everybody in politics falls into the category of either a pack or reformer. And that people are either morally driven or that they're driven by self-interest.
Right.
I think a lot of the people on the far right in the United States, the survivalists and that sort of thing, are morally driven, but their values are different from mine. And then a lot of the people who are liberals, part of the liberal elite, speak the language of reform but actually govern as hacks.
I think that's true. I look at a fellow like Ron Paul. I agree with his anti-empire position. I agree with his anti-surveillance Big Brother position. But everything else he says is destructive and stupid. And, what are you going to do with something like that? So I think you're right. I mean, there are just a lot of crossovers. But I also feel that the United States is not the place where these problems are going to be solved. We're just going to implode. And so, my advice to Canada, Mexico, or Estonia for that matter is keep your distance. This is not a model for you to copy. It's not what you should be doing. Above all, the United States is the great experiment in getting people to give up what counts most as a human being and to substitute toys for it. This will be how the United States is remembered. Substitute satisfaction. So bigger house, bigger income, more toys and all that. And meanwhile, you're rotting on the inside. That is the legacy, finally, of the U.S. And I would encourage any nation, don't go down that path. Don't go down that path. I think we'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.